quite self-evident that the American independence changed the world forever, and is the likely for the status held of America today. The principles of which independence sought shape the way that America is governed today, which reflects on the relevance of this time.
In the summer of 1776, the vast and powerful Empire of Great Britain found itself in a war with its North American colonies. The British were fighting their second war in the New World in a span of 20 years. They had been victorious in the war with the French, and now battled their colonists on the soil of the land they'd won from the French and their native allies. The conflict had been perilous for both sides. It pitted two unlikely foes, the unorthodox colonials who fought for liberty, and the regulars of the British Army who represented the heart of the empire who'd made a reputation displaying their power around the globe.
The American colonies, who had revolted, believed it was their God-given right to be entitled a government who served the needs of its people graciously and respectfully. The British government, headed by the reigning monarch, George III, used whatever system possible to manage a prosperous economic and political society within their homeland of England, Scotland, and Ireland, the center of the British Empire. In the process of keeping affairs in order domestically, they denied their colonies the right and attention they deserved as subjects of the crown. In the late 1760s, the British had found themselves in a state of economic turmoil following the French and Indian War, which promptly ended in 1763, when French forces surrendered their colonies to the New World. Britain had a tremendous war debt and needed to find a way to compile reimbursement to deliver its private funders and diplomatic allies who had supported them in the war with France. They discovered they could garner a great amount of revenue from colonial taxes, and the Parliament voted to increase tax rates on foreign colonies. The citizens of Britain were financially satisfied during this period, but Britain's colonies found themselves paying a huge portion of Britain's war debts.
The colonists in North America were especially angered by these decisions because the war they were paying off was Britain's war, not theirs, though they had fought and died alongside the British during the course of it. The North American 13 colonies, extending from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south, also had no say or representation in parliamentary decisions made overseas. Other factors also sparked political unrest within the 13 colonies. It was decisions such as the Tea Act and the occupation of soldiers in the colonies during a time of peace that were made without consent of colonial governments that angered the people within the North American colonies. Britain's military occupation in the colonies led to verbal and sometimes even physical conflict between colonials and soldiers. One of the most prominent altercations came in 1770 when a unit of British regulars fired on a band of civilian men who had been jeering them. One soldier fired, and a townsman with a cudgel struck him over the hands with such force that he dropped his firelock. However, the soldiers continued to fire successively till 7 or 8, as some say 11 guns were discharged, as reported in the Boston Gazette the following day, March 12, 1770. 5 people were killed and 6 were injured in the event that would be known as the Boston Massacre. This event triggered a massive colonial propaganda movement that spread like wildfire. The propaganda depicted the British as overbearing tyrants reaping the economic benefits the colonies provided. The Tea Act, initiated in 1773, provided a monopoly for the East India Company, which, in all purposes, forced the colonists to import tea only from the EIC. Colonists took this commercial action by Parliament as another violation of taxation without representation, a slogan that had become very popular among colonists. In response to the Tea Act, a band of Massachusetts colonists, known as the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, disguised themselves as Indians and boarded the HMS Dartmouth, an EIC trade ship docked in Boston, where they dumped 342 chests of imported tea into Boston Harbor. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party.
In 1775, war finally broke out. The shot heard around the world was fired when Massachusetts militia and British troops converged on one another at Lexington, though it is unknown who actually fired first. This was a turning point because war had been waged between king and colonies, and it would have been a drastic political and economic effects on the world for the time to come. As war developed and the king began to take offensive measures for his military, the Second Continental Congress assembled and did the same for theirs. In mid-1775, the American Congress called for a formation of a Continental Army and appointed French and Indian War veteran and Virginian statesman George Washington as its commander.
The war raged on for a year. British troops used the sea to transport their soldiers started to take control of key ports in the northern and southern regions of North America. It was during this time that members of Congress started to advocate for independence. In June of 1776, the Continental Congress selected several delegates with the task of drafting an official document declaring independence from Great Britain. The group of men, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson, would form the Committee of Five. Jefferson, a Southern delegate, would author the document. Jefferson worked tirelessly to find the right wording and presentation. The document began with a statement that read, "Behold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
The committee submitted the declaration on June 28, 1776, titled "A Declaration by the Representatives of the United States of America and General Congress Assembled." After days of congressional revisions, the declaration was finally adopted in the early morning of July 4, 1776, in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. On July 5th, delegates from all of the 13 colonies signed the document, and independence had been officially declared by the new American nation. One aspect not addressed directly was the issue of slavery. Slavery had been established and practiced long before the events of the American Revolution, so many thought of it as a natural part of society, and learned to become dependent on the hard labor of enslaved people. Though the document reads, "All men are created equal," not all viewed the African slaves of the period as equal individuals. Though people in the decades following independence criticized the failure to acknowledge slavery, the American Revolution was the trigger for the first abolitionist movements. The Founding Fathers included began to rethink the concept, but many reserved their thoughts for personal opinion. Thomas Jefferson, the legal owner of over 200 slaves, who worked at his plantation at Monticello, had come to the conclusion that slavery was immoral, but never advocated or spoke out against it from the time as the author of the Declaration to his tenure as the third President of the United States. George Washington, also a slave owner, thought similarly to Jefferson and used his position as commander of the Continental Army to establish a system where black men could offer military service in exchange for their freedom. One can interpret the issue of the time in many ways, but the conclusion stands that the Revolution was a turning point in history for black Americans as well as whites.
Within the weeks following the Declaration, British forces sieged and eventually captured New York. This served as a cold message to the newly formed nation that Britain was not ready to surrender the war or their colonies. The King and Parliament were reluctant to recognize the United States as a sovereign state. In their eyes, their land was still infested with rebels whose campaign needed to be crushed. An issue was that there were more of those who favored independence than those who chose to remain loyal to crown and country. In most cases, many loyalists, or Tories, fled the United States to go back to Great Britain, or they settled in Britain's colonies in Canada, which made it difficult for British soldiers to find hospitality or provisions in the regions they occupied. They might have driven out the Continental Army, but the mobs of angry colonists remained.
The attitude of independence and pride drastically shifted the balance of power to Washington and his army. France and Spain were eager to recognize and ally themselves with a new nation and sent military assistance to retaliate against rival Britain.
It was in 1781 that the United States was finally able to achieve total victory. The major portion of the British Army was trapped at Yorktown, Virginia. British forces under General Charles Cornwallis were surrounded by American forces by land and French forces by sea. A combined coalition of American and French forces sieged the fort held by the British for a couple of weeks before they eventually surrendered completely. The conflict ended, and total independence had been won by the American people.
American independence was delivered on the foundation that a government is to be implemented to serve the needs of the people as governed by the people. This was indeed a turning point in history because it shaped a new form of government that would have lasting effects on the world. The Declaration of Independence had the philosophy that when a government becomes destructive and withdraws or denies basic public rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. The Declaration states that people, when under the stress of an oppressive and powerful government, have the duty to appoint a new government that defends civility and freedom, as well as guards the absolute rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The French followed by example in years following American independence. The Americans had influenced the world, and a global surge of democracy and republicanism drowned the ancient ideals of monarchy, and a new international political society would emerge, making the events of the American Revolution one of the greatest turning points in human history.